And then we get to the biggest story. What is the biggest story and the most shocking story of 2022? This is a no-brainer. This has been the wildest year ever in wrestling. It has been an exhausting 5 years since January 1st. But the biggest story of the year, by far, is Vince McMahon resigning as the chairman and CEO of WWE and Triple H taking over as the new head of creative. There was no bigger story in wrestling all year, or the past decade plus, for that matter. When you think about wrestling and you think about WWE, it's always been about Vince, right? Everything's revolved around Vince McMahon. And we have talked about this, and I have covered this on the podcast. I've been doing this show for 15 years. And especially in the last few years, especially on Monday Night Raw over the last 5 years, maybe longer. We've talked about how the quality of the shows have gone down. At one point, Raw was the worst show on television. And unfortunately, although there was some improvement over the summer, Raw has kind of faded. I don't know if I would call it the worst show on TV, but it's pretty close to where it was before. But we've talked about all the issues with Vince McMahon and his booking and the people that he would push and the people that he wouldn't push and wouldn't call up or that he would release, and the stories about him, throwing out the scripts hours before the show and blowing it up, and then why even have a creative team? And these stories would come out. And it would sound like a fucking nightmare to work for this guy. But you would watch the product on TV, and there were things that you can, pick out of it that you liked. And we had this great WrestleMania this year. But for the most part, for a while now, it was a case where this was a company in dire need of a new creative vision. Because you've had the same person in the chair for decades. And now he's 77 years old. And at what point do you realize, hey, it's time to maybe go in a different direction? Yeah, it's his company, but we sure could use a fresh pair of eyes and a fresh creative vision for this show, a new showrunner. But we were never going to get that. Unless Vince McMahon died or retired, and the thought was he would never retire. And I'll guarantee you, there was never going to be a Vince McMahon retirement were it not for the controversy that popped up this year with the women and the hush money payments and the potential devastating impact that could have had on the stock. And Vince McMahon obviously felt like to save his company or to not be a burden on his company, he was advised the best thing to do would be to step down and step away. And that's what he did. Against his wishes, and now he might tell you against his better judgment, he stepped down and he stepped away. And his daughter is now the co-CEO of the company with Nick Khan. Triple H has ascended to the position that we always imagined he would end up in up until the last few years, especially when he got sick and almost died last year. It looked like Triple H was never going to ascend to that position. At one time, it was a no-brainer. Triple H and Stephanie, they're the heir apparents. They're going to take over one day. And then it became like, you know what? This doesn't look like it's going to happen. Triple H almost fucking died last year. And then Vince McMahon dismantled almost his entire team in NXT and blew the whole fucking thing up. Then his own daughter says, I'm going to step away and take a leave of absence. And they buried her on the way out in some of the business trades. So Triple H had this serious health episode. He was out of the picture for months. Stephanie steps away. It looked like the succession plan was blown to pieces. Nobody knew what the future of this company looked like. And to see how things have ended up here, as we sit here at the end of this year, with Vince out of the picture, supposedly thinking about trying to claw his way back into the picture, but him being out of the picture, Stephanie being the CEO, Triple H being the head of creative, and putting his stamp on things and bringing back people that Vince fired and trying new concepts that Vince never would have tried on the main roster, like War Games and the Fight Pit and some of this other stuff. It is amazing to see how things have changed in such a short period of time. But the best thing to happen to WWE in forever was Vince McMahon going away. Which is why when I talked about the Wall Street Journal story, last week, the week before, whatever it was, I said the best thing that Vince could do if he really cares about WWE is to stay the fuck away. Nothing good can come from him going back to the same position that he was in before. I don't care what you think of the job that Triple H has done so far. Bringing back Vince McMahon, the one who got us in this position in the first place where people were begging for change is not the right answer. Going back to the old way is not the right answer. And it's the best thing that has happened to this company in ages. Because now there's actually the potential for real change. We have not seen what a Triple H booked Royal Rumble looks like. We have not seen what a Triple H booked WrestleMania is going to look like. He has not even been in this position for 1 full year. Vince McMahon had 40 of them. So I'm willing to give it time to see a year from now what Triple H's WWE looks like, as compared to what it looks like right now. There have been positive changes made. There have been some not so positive changes made. There have been returns that I agreed with, and there have been returns that have been duds. But the fact that Vince McMahon is no longer in charge, if you would have said that to me 6 months ago, or 8 months ago, or a year ago when I did my year in review show last year in 2021, I would have told you were out of your fucking mind. Nothing can take this man down, except Vince McMahon. He took himself down. And that is the biggest story of this year, because this will have repercussions on the wrestling business, not just his company, but the entire industry going forward. We've already seen it with people willing to come back and wanting to come back to work for WWE because Vince McMahon is gone. And maybe now things will be different, or maybe they didn't get along with Vince McMahon, or they thought Vince McMahon didn't like them. So people who otherwise would have stayed in AEW or signed with AEW maybe now will come to WWE. Triple H, I'm sure, is already making great plans to expand into other territories. He's talked about opening performance centers in NXT, NXT Japan, NXT Europe is supposedly going to launch at some point next year. And the jury is out on how positive that's going to be for those places. I don't think that's going to be a very, very good thing for those places at all. For WWE, it might be, but not for those areas that they're basically going to be invading. But we're looking at a completely different wrestling landscape now than we did at the beginning of this year, which is exciting to think about because at least it's something different. At least we might actually see things that we never would have seen under Vince McMahon. Now there's real hope that we might be able to see those things. That is the biggest story of this year, and it's not even close. But it was hardly the only big story this year. There has been no shortage of crazy stories in 2022. We have the media scrum. The media scrum from hell at Brawl Out, which would have been number 1 were it not for the Vince McMahon stuff. With CM Punk's Gripebomb, as some people are calling it, the fallout from what happened that night. CM Punk wins back the AEW World Championship in Chicago, in his hometown. MJF returns to the company. The Elite, right? They win the trios titles. Kenny Omega had only recently come back after being gone for almost a year. This should have been a joyous time for AEW and Tony Khan, who we didn't learn until much later on was going through his own personal crisis at that time behind the scenes with his mother, who he almost lost. So this should have been a happy time for AEW, and instead the company devolved seemingly into chaos. And there was question about whether or not they'd even be able to recover from this, because in one night, they lost 4 of their biggest names. They just crowned 4 new champions. Matt Jackson, Nick Jackson, Kenny Omega, CM Punk all had new hardware when that night was over. And before the week was even over, they were all stripped. And Tony Khan had to rethink what his direction was going to be heading into the fall now for his company. He had to call upon Jon Moxley. He had to take things in a different direction. And that could have been devastating to this company. Some people say that it is devastating to the company. They lost CM Punk, who would have been gone anyway because he got hurt. But, their ratings have suffered as a result, as if Punk was drawing $1 million audiences every week. Nobody is doubting the ratings and business impact that CM Punk did have. I think people are also overstating it when they talk about how, they'll never get to 1 million consistently again, and they'll never do this and they'll never do that, as if they were doing that all the time when Punk was still there. It's a big blow. There's no doubt about it. Punk did good business for AEW. Tony Khan defended him like you would never believe after the Double or Nothing scrum against the criticism that Eric Bischoff had leveled at CM Punk not being a draw. And Tony Khan went off on him for it. So he definitely had a positive impact on business. Losing him is going to hurt the company. But it was the right move to make, because you can't do what Punk did in the media scrum and embarrass the company and embarrass the head of that company the way that he did, and not have consequences for that. Just because you're the top star in the company, you should not be excused from that. So he lost a lot of big stars in one fell swoop, and it wasn't about what a great show they had. It was about all the bullshit that came after the show and all the drama that came out of it in the investigation and all of the nonsense. That is not something that Tony Khan needed. It was not something that made Tony Khan look good as he sat there and just listened to Punk going on about somebody who wasn't even on the fucking show, who had nothing to do with the show, going off on Scott Colton. Who gives a shit? Talking about politics and talking about people talking behind his back, whether it's true or not, it was not the right forum for him to air those grievances. We had Festivus on Friday. That's when you air the grievances. You don't air the grievances at the post-show scrum on what should have been a happy night for AEW. We had Tony Khan buying Ring of Honor from Sinclair Broadcast Group. Tony Khan was a huge fan of Ring of Honor back in the day. He did not want to see Ring of Honor fall into the hands of Vince McMahon and WWE and turned into a tab on Peacock. He wanted to try to preserve the legacy of Ring of Honor and breathe new life into the company, when clearly Sinclair was not going to do that. Sinclair basically shut down Ring of Honor. It was supposed to be a temporary shutdown at the end of last year. But I think when it happened, a lot of people, myself included, looked at that and said, yeah, they claim they'll be back up and running in April, but I had my doubts. Tony Khan evidently had his doubts. So he swooped in and he bought Ring of Honor, and he went on Dynamite back at the beginning of March, and he made that big announcement at Daly's Place. You know, the name on the contract isn't Shane. It's not Shane. It's me. He's such a nerd, but he's a wrestling nerd, right? He loves wrestling. He's the big super fan who's throwing his money around, and he thinks that he could help revive Ring of Honor, which is something that has yet to happen. He tried to get a television deal for them. He was unsuccessful. Ring of Honor is not going to have a show on Honor Club if they have interest from an actual television network. So he tried, and so far he failed to secure a television deal. Ring of Honor still has no weekly show. They will in 2023. What that will look like, we don't know yet. The jury is still out of whether or not this is going to be a success. It may not be viable. Who knows if Ring of Honor will still be run as a separate entity a year from now. Tony Khan is also a businessman, and if it's not working, at some point he may have to pull the plug. I used to be a Ring of Honor fan as well. Some of the most fun experiences that I've ever had at a wrestling show came at live Ring of Honor shows in the mid-2000s. So I have a place in my heart in wrestling fandom for Ring of Honor, just like a lot of other people do. But can Ring of Honor be sustained as its own separate entity? I don't know. Tony Khan has a tough hill to climb if he's going to make that work. Especially with all the attention that he has to pay to AEW. And talent that isn't being used, and when stuff like the media scrum comes up, that's where his focus needs to be. So is he going to bring in somebody to kind of help oversee things with Ring of Honor? I mean, we don't know. There's still a lot of questions that are unanswered about this. How big of a story this will truly end up being, because right now it just feels more like a vanity project than anything else. But at the time, when he announced it, that was big news. And there were a lot of fans who were very excited to see what he would do with it. I think a lot of those fans, their excitement waned when they saw that AEW was being turned into Ring of Honor on some weeks. That's not what they wanted. But what 2023 holds for ROH, we have to wait and see. And then there's Cody Rhodes, one of the founding fathers and EVPs of AEW, leaving the company. He becomes the first EVP to leave, to go back to WWE. This was a shocking story because I think a lot of people didn't actually think that this would happen. There were rumors about it. There were people joking about how we're going to see Cody in the Royal Rumble. And even I kind of knocked those rumors and said, yeah, okay, you'll see me in the Royal Rumble this year before you see Cody Rhodes. Cody Rhodes did not make the Royal Rumble, but Cody Rhodes was at WrestleMania. And he made a hell of a return. And when he came back, this was not the same Cody Rhodes that left the company 6 years ago. This was not Stardust. He came back and he felt like a star. He went away and he showed Vince McMahon, look, this is what I can do. I can be a main event star. I can be a top attraction for you. Just give me the chance. He had unfinished business in this company. He didn't like the way that he left WWE in the first place. And whatever the issues were that led to him deciding I have to leave here and I'm going to go back to WWE, That was a huge loss for Tony Khan. And it was a huge loss for what it said, which is that if Cody could leave, then anybody can leave. Because Cody, you would look at him and think this guy's going to be AEW for life. He was one of the founding fathers of this company. He was the one going on television and taking little pot shots and digs at WWE, and yet he's the first one to go back. So for as much as what it represents about the pendulum starting to swing in the other direction, so much of that talent, it was pretty much all going in one direction, right? They were fleeing WWE and they were going the other way. All of a sudden, it felt like the pendulum is starting to swing in the other direction. And Cody, before he got hurt, it was only a few months, but he was having a hell of a run. Undefeated, going out there, having great matches with Seth Rollins. He had that performance at Hell in a Cell. He's going to come back. Cody Rhodes is going to be the WWE champion. As soon as WrestleMania this year, Cody Rhodes will be the WWE champion. So for him, it's been a huge change. But for AEW, it was a huge loss. We had William Regal. William Regal started the year fired by WWE. He got swept up in that whole mess of everybody being let go from Triple H's team down at NXT. He got fired. Then he signed with AEW. Then he asked to leave AEW a few months ago. And he ends 2022 back in WWE. He doesn't officially start until the first week of next year. But he has an agreement in place to go back to WWE, this time as a vice president. So think about that as a year. Fired by WWE, signs with AEW, leaves AEW, ends up back in WWE, all in the same calendar year. I don't think anybody would have predicted any of that. Nobody would have predicted that Regal would get fired in the first place. Nobody would have expected him to show up in AEW. And then nobody would have predicted that he'd be back in WWE by now. But here we are. One of those years, right? It's too bad because Regal could have been, I think, a very positive influence behind the scenes in that. As much as I enjoy him as an on-air character, we're not going to be seeing him on television for quite a while. Because per his contract, he will not be allowed to appear on television for at least a year. As much as I enjoy William Regal on screen, he could have been a very positive influence for a very long time for Tony Khan behind the scenes. His loss is WWE's gain. But it shouldn't be that much of a surprise. Triple H loves Regal. He's been friends with Regal. Regal looked out for him when he was in WCW back in the mid-90s. Regal is sort of one of his chief lieutenants. I made the comparison several weeks ago. I said he could be to Triple H what Pat Patterson was effectively to Vince McMahon. Or you could say Bruce Pritchard. I kind of looked at it as a Patterson and Vince thing. But here we are. And Regal is going to be a VP now in WWE. We had Sasha Banks and Naomi, the women's tag team champions in WWE, walking out of the company on a Monday night before Raw, a Raw show they were supposed to be on. They put their belts down on Johnny Ace's desk, and they walk out of the company, still to this day, never to return. And now Sasha Banks is going to be showing up at Wrestle Kingdom for New Japan next week. So that was a big story when it broke. We covered it at length. We have not seen Naomi since then. Sasha, there's been rumors about Sasha all year. Now, finally, we have a sense of what her future is going to be. She's going to be free. As of the first of this year, as of next weekend, she's going to be a free woman. And I think 2023 is going to be the year of Mercedes. I think we're going to see this woman pop up in a lot of places. And potentially, she'll end up back in WWE at some point. But why not play the field? Right? Call your own shots. Do what you want. Now is the time. Try to blow up your name as much as possible. Because she doesn't need WWE, and WWE doesn't really need her, but they would certainly benefit by having Sasha Banks, and losing Sasha Banks is a major loss for the WWE women's division. So I am excited to see what her 2023 is going to look like. But them walking out was a very big story when it happened back in May. Feels like a lifetime ago. Speaking of feeling like a lifetime ago, I've mentioned all of these stories, and only now am I getting to the fact that Stone Cold Steve Austin returned to the ring after a 19-year absence to wrestle Kevin Owens in the main event of WrestleMania. We got Stone Cold back in the ring in the main event of WrestleMania. And what is this? I have this, I'm not ranking these, but I'm only getting to this like the fifth or sixth or maybe seventh biggest story of the year. But it really happened. And Austin looked good. He looks even better now. You check out his training videos on Instagram. Boy, he's in full training mode. He's getting ready for something. We had MJF and the AEW drama around Double or Nothing, where he no-showed a meet and greet that weekend. He supposedly got into a shouting match with Tony Khan. It led to him booking a flight home that I don't believe he ended up being on. But we weren't sure if he would show up to do the job for Wardlow that weekend. He did. He took the 10 power bombs. But what should have been the biggest match of Wardlow's career was completely overshadowed by all the drama involving MJF, which then led to the infamous promo where he called Tony Khan a fucking mark on live TV. And by that point, I'm sure it was pretty clear at that point that this is all part of a larger angle. I don't think it started that way. I do believe that there was probably discontent between the two sides, and MJF may have wanted more money. He probably got what he wanted. Then they turned it into an angle. But I don't believe it started that way. I don't doubt that there was real-life tension there between the two sides. And there were legitimate questions about what, if any, future would he have in AEW. But the one I feel really bad for out of all this, because he didn't do anything wrong, and he really got fucked over because of all of this, and never recovered, was Wardlow. After being released by WWE late last year, Jeff Hardy made his debut for AEW to much fanfare. But it was short-lived after getting popped for his third DUI in 10 years. He was pulled from TV, he got sent to rehab, still has a court date pending. They keep pushing back this pretrial hearing. I feel like they're just going to keep pushing it back until the end of time. He just got another delay until next month. But he still has this legal matter, this court date hanging over his head, which will determine what his future in AEW looks like. He could still end up behind bars before all is said and done. But if history is any guide when it comes to Jeff Hardy, he'll probably get off with a slap on the wrist. After 413 days as the NXT Women's Champion and having the best run of her career, Mandy Rose fired by WWE, right? We couldn't end this year without at least one big story in the month of December. You got to have at least one per month. That was the big story of this month. That caught a lot of people by surprise. It caught me by surprise that she even had a fan time page. Right? The more you know. Shane McMahon returned to WWE at the Royal Rumble and then was promptly sent home by Vince McMahon. Sent home by his father. Sent to his room. There were WrestleMania plans in place for Shane. Elimination Chamber. He was supposed to be part of that match. It all got wiped out. Because he showed up at the Royal Rumble, he was helping to book the Royal Rumble, and he was being a disruptive force. He was trying to make himself look good at the expense of others, and Vince McMahon said, "Get your ass out of here. That's cold." Basically fired his own son. Fired his own son, and then when she announced her leave of absence, buried his own daughter on her way out of the company. He's a cold man. Big E broke his neck on SmackDown before WrestleMania this year. He was in a match, got dropped on his head outside by Ridge Holland. That could have been a lot worse than it was. As bad as it was, it could have been tragic. And not only was he okay and breathing and talking that night, but now he's moving around normal. He's out of the neck brace and moving around like a normal person, but we still have no idea if he'll ever be able to get back in the ring. And he recently said that he will not even have a scan and an evaluation until they hit the 1 year mark, which again, I believe is in March. They won't even know until then what his wrestling future may or may not look like. I look at this and I say, if he never wrestles another match again, as long as he can live a normal, healthy, pain-free life, to me, that's the most important thing. And he has basically said as much, like whatever's going to be is going to be. He's at peace with it. But that was a very scary situation. Thankfully, he's doing better, but what his future looks like, completely up in the air. AEW and New Japan, they had the Forbidden Door pay-per-view with Tanahashi and Okada, each making their Dynamite debuts in the weeks leading up to the show. We talked about the Forbidden Door and what a big show that was. Nick Aldis had a very public split with the NWA, and Billy Corgan disgraced his company by putting Tyrus on top as the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. Kyrie became the first ever IWGP Women's Champion. We had the death of the NXT UK brand. We had the death of the 24/7 Championship, the one death I can get behind this year. And unfortunately, we had the death of Scott Hall back in March, and the death of Antonio Inoki back in October. Two very big names that the wrestling world lost this year. So as I said, this will go down as the craziest year that I can remember in wrestling. A lot of positive things happened this year. A lot of negative things happened this year. There's good, there's bad. But if there's one thing you could say about 2022, it was not a boring year.